The story of the Necrontyr begins in a distant and hostile cradle world, a place that defined every aspect of their civilization. Long before their transformation into the immortal machine forms known across the galaxy as the Necrons, the Necrontyr were a mortal species bound by flesh, frailty, and time. Their earliest identity was shaped by their home star, a cruel sun that bathed their planet in lethal radiation. This environment scarred their bodies, shortened their lives, and set the course of their culture and destiny. Unlike the long-lived Eldari or the sturdy Krork of antiquity, the Necrontyr inherited a legacy of fragility. Their biology was a sentence of decline from the moment of birth, and this single fact influenced their society, their ambitions, and eventually their decision to gamble with forces far beyond mortal comprehension. The Necrontyr were tall by human standards, their skeletal frames stretched by their physiology into imposing silhouettes. Accounts describe them as lean and almost cadaverous in appearance, with elongated limbs and features that appeared gaunt even in health. Their skin often bore a sickly pallor, washed pale by generations living beneath the hostile light of their star. Many carried burn-like marks and disfigurations caused by the constant exposure to solar radiation. Their lifespan rarely extended beyond a few decades. Where other species could plan for centuries of empire building or dynastic legacy, the Necrontyr were perpetually pressed for time. A youth could become an elder within 30 or 40 years, and the cycle of inheritance moved quickly. The shadow of inevitable death pressed heavily on their culture, instilling both desperation and resentment against the universe that had cursed them with brevity. This shortened span of life generated a paradox. On one hand, the Necrontyr were driven to achieve as much as possible within their meagre allotment of years. Their society developed rapidly, racing against the clock of mortality. On the other hand, this urgency often led to instability. Dynasties rose and fell within a single human's lifetime, and entire political movements could vanish in the span of a generation. The inevitability of decline gnawed at their collective psyche. Their scientists searched endlessly for cures to their affliction. Their rulers promised salvation through technological advancement or conquest, and their priests preached that meaning must be extracted in the face of cruel fate. Yet despite their efforts, no remedy for the toll of their sun was found. The Necrontyr homeworld itself mirrored the hardships of its inhabitants. It was a planet scorched by radiation storms, its skies often filled with dust and solar flare residue. Settlements were constructed beneath great metal shielding or within subterranean networks to minimize exposure. But even with such measures, the sickness of their sun was inescapable. Their architecture was functional and austere, constructed from dark materials resistant to weathering and designed to endure centuries of harsh conditions. This environment fostered a people who were simultaneously resilient and bitter. Where the Eldar crafted beauty in their habitats, the Necrontyr built tomb-like cities that seemed to embody both protection and resignation. Every structure was a shield against the inevitable, yet none offered true escape. The early purpose of the Necrontyr as a civilization can be traced to their obsession with understanding and defying mortality. Their earliest recorded endeavours involved astronomical observation and medical experimentation. They gazed at the stars with both hope and envy. Hope, because the void beyond their cursed sun might hold answers to their plight. Envy, because the stars represented longevity and permanence, while their own lives burned away like sparks in the cosmic wind. The Necrontyr became pioneers in the study of cosmic forces, but always with the underlying question of how such knowledge might free them from their affliction. The very act of turning their eyes outward from their homeworld was driven not by curiosity in the abstract, but by the urgent need to escape their condition. Biologically, the Necrontyr exhibited a suite of traits shaped by their environment. Their bone structure was lightweight but brittle, making them more fragile than many other intelligent species. Their nervous systems were highly sensitive, adapted to living under constant exposure to harmful radiation, but this same adaptation came with high rates of neurological disease and degeneration. Hair and skin were often sparse, as genetic damage accumulated across generations. Eyes described in records as sunken and reflective often had a yellowish tint, perhaps a result of constant radiation exposure. What the Necrontyr lacked in vitality, they compensated for with sharp intellect and relentless discipline. Their intelligence was rarely wasted on leisure. It was channeled towards survival and expansion, because indulgence had no place in a society where time itself was always running out. From these biological and environmental foundations arose their early military doctrines. Warfare for the Necrontyr was not an optional pursuit, but a necessity. Their world's hostility bred constant competition for resources, and their shortened lifespans meant that conflict could be swift, brutal, and decisive. Unlike the protracted wars of other civilizations, Necrontyr conflicts often reached resolution within a single generation, with little regard for the preservation of life. Soldiers were recruited at young ages, often before their third decade, since waiting too long risked losing potential fighters to the inevitability of disease and aging. This urgency shaped their entire military system, which prioritized rapid mobilization, efficiency, and minimal delay in decision-making. Their armies were not vast compared to other species of the time, but they were organized with remarkable precision. The Necrontyr understood that every soldier's life was a fleeting asset, so battles were calculated to maximize short-term results. Rather than long campaigns of attrition, they favored strategies that aimed for swift dominance, sudden strikes, overwhelming use of newly developed technologies, and a focus on breaking enemy morale before their own forces succumbed to decay. Commanders rose quickly from the ranks, but just as quickly they could be replaced, as age and illness removed them from service. The churn of leadership within their armies mirrored the churn of leadership within their dynasties, creating an atmosphere where no single general could maintain dominance for long without extraordinary ability. Recruitment was often bound to the dynastic system that defined their politics. Each ruling dynasty maintained its own military forces, loyal first to the line of rulers and only secondarily to the broader Necrontyr civilization. This created constant internal tension, as dynasties competed for dominance even while external threats loomed. Young men and women were pressed into service according to their dynasty's needs, and training was harsh, emphasizing discipline, endurance, and obedience over personal survival. The Necrontyr valued loyalty to the dynasty above all else, for dynasties were their only continuity in a world where individuals died quickly. To serve was to contribute to the fleeting immortality of one's lineage, even if one's own life would burn out swiftly. Weapons and armor of the early Necrontyr reflected their pragmatic mindset. Simplicity and lethality took precedence over artistry. Their weapons often relied on energy projection or early plasma-based technology, crude compared to the later Gauss weaponry they would one day wield, but still devastating in their time. Armor was functional, designed to protect against radiation as much as against enemy attack. Units were frequently clad in metallic suits that doubled as life support systems, shielding their fragile bodies from the ravages of both war and their environment. These suits were heavy and cumbersome, but they extended the soldier's lifespan long enough to make use of them in battle. Despite the grimness of their condition, the Necrontyr were not a stagnant people. They possessed a burning drive to prove themselves against the universe that had cursed them. Military service was often seen not only as duty but as a defiance of fate. To fight and die in battle was preferable to slowly wasting away from sickness. The dynasties encouraged this mindset, framing military sacrifice as a noble answer to the cruelty of the cosmos. Thus, recruitment was not difficult to maintain, for the Necrontyr understood that every life would end swiftly regardless. To dedicate that life to a cause gave it meaning, however fleeting. The origins and biology of the Necrontyr, combined with their military doctrines, formed the foundation of a civilization that was both ambitious and doomed. Their obsession with mortality created a people perpetually striving for more, yet perpetually undermined by the very conditions of their existence. Their early purpose was survival through mastery of technology and warfare. Their biology was a curse that shaped their every decision. Their military doctrines were a reflection of lives too brief to waste on hesitation. In every aspect, the Necrontyr were defined by the tension between their desire for permanence and the inescapable truth of impermanence. It was this tension that would one day lead them down the path of their greatest gamble, a gamble that transformed them from a dying race of mortals into an undying race of machines. The technological development of the Necrontyr reflected the conditions of their lives, functional, austere, and driven by desperation. Where other civilizations pursued artistry, leisure, or spiritual meaning, the Necrontyr applied nearly all of their intellectual energies toward extending life, protecting themselves against the radiation of their sun, and building tools to wage war against both environment and rival dynasties. Their technology carried a distinct aesthetic, marked by angular precision, heavy use of dark alloys, and a tomb-like quality that echoed the mortality which overshadowed their existence. To outsiders, it might have appeared as though their entire technological culture was defined by an obsession with shielding against decay, and in truth, this was not far from reality. In their earliest years of expansion, the Necrontyr pioneered protective gear designed to mitigate the damage of their star's radiation. Simple shielding eventually evolved into sophisticated full-body suits, often metallic and segmented, that allowed workers and soldiers to operate for extended periods in open sunlight. These suits were fitted with respirators, filtration systems, and crude forms of cooling units, reflecting both their ingenuity and the inescapable fragility of their bodies. Armor and protective wear became so commonplace that it blurred the line between civilian and military applications. Miners, builders, and labourers might wear suits indistinguishable from the plating used by soldiers, the difference lying only in armament. Thus, the Necrontyr were a society in which technology was not simply a tool, but a constant second skin, a shield against both labour and war. Weaponry of the Necrontyr during this pre-metallic stage was brutal and efficient. They favoured directed energy weapons, projectile systems, and the early experimental precursors to the Gauss technology that would later define them as Necrons. Handheld arms often took the form of sleek, rod-like devices or heavier shoulder-mounted platforms. These were not decorated or embellished, for Necrontyr weaponry was not about honour or ceremony, but about function. Tools of death were crafted with the same mentality as mining drills or construction beams. They existed to serve a purpose, and that purpose was destruction. The lack of ornamentation reflected a culture in which beauty was secondary to endurance, and in which mortality gave little incentive for elaborate artistry. Vehicles represented another extension of this functional style. Land-based transports were typically heavily shielded, squat and angular, resembling great slabs of metal rolling across the wastelands of their homeworld. Engines were designed less for speed and more for resilience, able to endure high radiation environments and storms that could tear apart unprotected craft. Within atmosphere, aircraft were developed as sturdy wedge-shaped machines, with minimal surface exposure, often crewed by multiple operators who worked together to compensate for the short operational lifespan of their technology. Spacefaring vessels emerged relatively early in their history, reflecting the Necrontyr's desire to look beyond their cursed sun. These ships were long, slender, and heavily plated, bearing an appearance not unlike the tomb structures of their cities. They were equipped with shielding systems that could withstand stellar radiation and cosmic storms, a necessity for a people whose very existence had been shaped by the hostility of their home star. Despite their fragility as a species, the Necrontyr demonstrated remarkable prowess in the sciences of energy manipulation and material engineering. Their tools, whether for labour or warfare, often drew upon plasma-based technologies and early forms of hyper-energetic projection. Mining lasers could be repurposed as weapons, and shielding systems could double as fortification generators. Civilian life and military application were rarely separated, because the Necrontyr never enjoyed the luxury of creating a divide between peace and war. For them, every tool carried the dual possibility of sustaining life or taking it away. Their civilization reflected a philosophy of dual-use functionality, an efficiency born from necessity. This technological pragmatism extended into medicine, though with less success. The Necrontyr poured vast resources into the study of biology and the search for cures to their radiation-racked condition. Medical technology became a pillar of their society, with hospitals and laboratories ranking as highly as fortresses in importance. Treatments involved regenerative therapies, controlled exposure to filtered energies, and the implantation of rudimentary cybernetics to extend functionality. While these methods offered temporary relief, none could overcome the genetic damage that accumulated across generations. Thus, their medical science was advanced in scope yet ultimately futile in purpose, fueling both frustration and bitterness. Their technology was capable of shielding against the environment but incapable of defeating mortality, and it was this failure that drove their leaders eventually to seek more radical answers. The social structure of the Necrontyr was as stark as their technology. Society was built around dynasties, each led by a ruling house that traced its authority back through ancestral lineage. These dynasties functioned both as political entities and as familial networks, binding together military, scientific, and economic power under a single banner. The dynastic system created a landscape of rivalry and competition, as each lineage sought dominance over its peers while simultaneously maintaining the cohesion needed to preserve their species. Interdynastic conflict was common, with wars fought as much for prestige and power as for survival. Loyalty to the dynasty eclipsed loyalty to any broader collective, for it was within the dynasty that an individual's short life found continuity and meaning. Leadership within these dynasties was absolute. The ruling lord or monarch of a dynasty wielded near-total authority over its members, commanding armies, directing scientific projects, and dictating policy. Subordinate leaders, such as generals or administrators, served at the pleasure of the dynasty head and could be replaced swiftly if they failed to achieve results. Given the brevity of Necrontyr life, leadership succession occurred frequently. Sons and daughters rose to power within decades, and dynasties often experienced rapid shifts in direction as new rulers imposed their will. This constant turnover generated both dynamism and instability. On one hand, it ensured a constant flow of innovation and change. On the other, it prevented long-term stability and fostered a culture of mistrust between dynasties. Values within Necrontyr society revolved around three central themes: endurance, loyalty, and legacy. Endurance was necessary for survival in their harsh world. Loyalty was demanded by dynasties that needed cohesion against both rivals and the environment. Legacy was the most powerful motivator, for with individual lives so short, the only true immortality was to be remembered as part of one's dynasty's achievements. Rituals of remembrance and ancestral veneration were central to their culture, though these rituals often carried a bitter undertone. They did not celebrate long-lived heroes, for such figures rarely existed. Instead, they memorialized fleeting achievements, erecting tombs and monuments to preserve the memory of those who had died young. It is telling that their architecture, even in their height, resembled funerary monuments more than palaces of celebration. Their values were a direct mirror of their mortality: to endure against all odds, to remain loyal to the dynasty, and to seek a legacy that defied the brevity of life. Civilian roles within Necrontyr society were tightly bound to necessity. Most individuals spent their lives in service to labour, whether in construction, mining, scientific research, or administrative duties for the dynasties. Leisure was minimal, for time was too precious to waste. Education was practical and focused on preparing youth for service as quickly as possible, whether that service be military or scientific. Artistic expression existed, but it was rarely indulgent. Instead, it manifested in the austere beauty of their architecture or the grim elegance of their funerary monuments. Civilians were often reminded of their mortality at every stage of life, and this awareness bred a stoic acceptance that one's role was to contribute to the dynasty while time remained. Military roles, on the other hand, carried both honour and burden. Soldiers were not necessarily granted higher status than civilians, but their sacrifice was viewed with a form of grim respect. To serve and die for the dynasty was a way of transforming one's short life into a contribution of lasting value. Commanders, though transient, were often revered as embodiments of loyalty, even as their deaths were expected and accepted. Military service was both a practical necessity and a cultural statement, a declaration that even in the face of inevitable decay, the Necrontyr would fight for legacy. The interaction between civilian and military life was fluid. A civilian labourer might be pressed into military service within a decade, only to return to labour if they survived. Scientists often doubled as weapons engineers, their laboratories serving as both centres of medical research and armories for developing new instruments of war. The lack of separation between these spheres reinforced the all-encompassing dominance of the dynasty over individual lives. No one was free from obligation. Every role was a contribution to the dynasty's attempt to endure. The picture that emerges of the Necrontyr in this era is one of a people bound together by technology, dynasty, and necessity. Their gear, tools, and vehicles reflected the harshness of their environment and the fragility of their bodies. Their social structure reinforced dynastic loyalty and constant rivalry. Their values elevated endurance and legacy above joy or leisure. Civilian and military roles merged into a single framework of service, each individual driven by the knowledge that their time was short and their only true permanence lay in what they left behind. It was a society simultaneously remarkable in its achievements and tragic in its limitations, for even as they reached toward the stars with their ships and their weapons, they could never escape the shadow of mortality that hung over them. When examining the Necrontyr before their transformation into the Necrons, one must remember that fame, leadership, and legacy were fleeting concepts for them. Their short lives ensured that very few individuals lived long enough to shape history in the way that an Eldari Farseer or a human Primarch might. Yet, there were dynastic rulers and war leaders whose deeds survived in record, etched into monuments and preserved within tomb structures that became as much political propaganda as memorial. These leaders embodied the Necrontyr condition, ambitious yet desperate, brilliant yet bound by decay. They ruled for decades that passed like centuries to their people, and their reputations endured long after their bodies had turned to dust. Among these figures, the most significant was Sarek, the ruler who would later be known as the Silent King. Sarek's reign occurred near the end of the Necrontyr's biological existence, but even before his decision to embrace biotransference, he represented the pinnacle of dynastic authority. As the last of the Silent Kings, he carried the weight of leading not merely a dynasty, but the entire Necrontyr species. His authority extended beyond the rivalries of dynasties, unifying them under a singular rule during a time of existential crisis. Before Sarek, other rulers rose and fell, but their influence remained confined to their dynasties or short-lived campaigns. Sarek alone achieved a form of supremacy that transcended the limitations of his people's brief lives. Other dynastic leaders were remembered less for unity and more for the conflicts they waged. Dynasties frequently immortalized their rulers through colossal tomb monuments, inscribed with exaggerated tales of conquest. One dynasty might celebrate a monarch who led a successful campaign against a rival settlement, while another might preserve the memory of a general who secured a temporary resource advantage. These figures became archetypes within Necrontyr culture: the warrior king, the cunning strategist, the protector of the dynasty. Their names rarely survived into later epochs, overshadowed by the machine immortality of the Necrons, but within the context of their era, they were seen as embodiments of defiance against mortality. The Necrontyr military, though limited in lifespan and endurance, produced distinct units and formations. The most iconic were their heavily armoured phalanxes, groups of soldiers clad in full-body shielding suits, carrying energy weapons and protective generators. These phalanxes were designed to advance methodically across battlefields, their angular formations mirroring the architectural austerity of their cities. Behind them often followed mobile weapons platforms, precursor war machines that blended construction and destruction. Some accounts describe early armoured walkers, bipedal constructs designed both for mining and for combat, outfitted with energy projectors or radiation cannons. These machines were clumsy by later galactic standards, but they represented the Necrontyr ability to adapt their technology across civilian and military boundaries. War machines of the Necrontyr bore names and reputations that transcended the individuals who commanded them. A dynasty might field a colossal land vehicle, its sides plated in blackened metal, capable of transporting an entire phalanx across irradiated wastelands. Others employed towering artillery constructs, capable of focusing stellar energies into beams that reduced fortifications to glass. These engines of war were revered almost as extensions of the dynasty itself. To march beneath the shadow of a dynasty's war machine was to carry its authority into battle, and their destruction was mourned as though a family member had been lost. Behaviourally, the Necrontyr displayed tendencies shaped by their harsh reality. They were instinctively fatalistic, aware from birth that their lives would be short and often painful. This produced a cultural stoicism, a tendency to endure hardship without complaint, for to resist fate was futile. At the same time, this fatalism bred ambition of a desperate kind. Knowing that their lives were brief, many sought glory, advancement, or recognition in whatever time remained. This duality, stoic endurance on one hand, frantic ambition on the other, defined much of Necrontyr behaviour. It also explained the volatility of their dynastic politics, where rulers might make bold, reckless decisions in pursuit of legacy, while their subjects accepted the risks as unavoidable. On the battlefield, these instincts translated into unwavering discipline. Necrontyr soldiers rarely broke formation or fled, not because of an absence of fear, but because fear itself was meaningless in a life already doomed to end. To die in battle was preferable to the slow decay of radiation sickness. This gave their armies a reputation for grim determination. They fought with a coldness that seemed almost machine-like even before their transformation, a reflection of a culture that had already come to terms with mortality. Rituals within Necrontyr society revolved heavily around death, remembrance, and the continuation of dynastic legacy. Funerary practices were among the most developed aspects of their culture. The construction of tombs was not simply an act of mourning, but a political statement. Dynasties competed to build the most enduring monuments, structures that would stand against the elements and proclaim the greatness of the deceased long after their death. Entire cities functioned as necropolises, with burial chambers and monuments dominating skylines. It is telling that even before their transformation into undying machines, the Necrontyr lived as though they already inhabited tombs. Rituals extended beyond death into daily life. Ceremonies of remembrance were held frequently, often marking the anniversaries of ancestors or the dedication of new tombs. Military victories were celebrated not with parades of living soldiers, but with the dedication of monuments to the dead. This obsession with funerary ritual reflected not only their mortality, but also their values of endurance and legacy. If life was fleeting, memory became the true measure of worth. Dynasties used these rituals as propaganda, reinforcing loyalty by ensuring that every member knew their sacrifice would be remembered. Ethics within Necrontyr society were shaped by necessity. Individual rights held little value compared to the needs of the dynasty. Sacrifice was not only expected but demanded, and refusal to serve was seen as dishonour to one's lineage. Ethics revolved around collective survival rather than individual fulfillment. At the same time, a harsh meritocracy existed within the dynasties. While lineage granted power to ruling families, ability and loyalty determined survival within the ranks. Soldiers, scientists, and labourers were judged by their contributions, and failure was punished with exile or death. Compassion was a rare virtue, overshadowed by pragmatism and the pursuit of legacy. Internal castes and divisions reinforced this structure. At the top were the ruling dynasties, monarchs, and their immediate bloodlines, who commanded both military and political power. Beneath them were the administrators, generals, and scientific leaders, individuals granted authority through proven loyalty and skill. The bulk of the population formed the labouring and military classes, their roles shifting as needed between construction, warfare, and service. At the lowest level existed those exiled from dynasties, individuals stripped of lineage and protection. These outcasts often perished swiftly in the wastelands of their world, but some are believed to have formed nomadic groups that harassed dynastic settlements. These divisions created a rigid but fragile hierarchy, one that could collapse with the death of a ruler or the failure of a dynasty to sustain itself. In many ways, the entire Necrontyr society was one vast caste defined by mortality itself. Regardless of rank or role, all were bound by the inevitability of decay. Even rulers could not escape their brief lives, and even the greatest monuments could not hide the reality of their suffering. This universal condition created a sense of unity, however tenuous, among the divisions. It also fueled the desperation that would eventually drive them to embrace biotransference, trading the frailty of flesh for the illusion of permanence. The Necrontyr in this stage of history were a civilization suspended between greatness and doom. Their leaders achieved fleeting fame, their armies marched beneath war machines that embodied dynastic power, and their rituals built cities of tombs to remember the dead. Their instincts drove them to stoicism and ambition, their ethics demanded sacrifice and loyalty, and their castes structured their society into dynasties and divisions. Yet beneath all of this lay the same truth. Every life was short, every dynasty vulnerable, and every monument a reminder of impermanence. It was this reality that defined them more than any ruler, unit, or war machine, and it was this reality that would eventually lead them to gamble their very souls in search of escape. The Necrontyr, known primarily to Imperial records as the precursor species to the Necrons, remain a subject of guarded discussion within the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their existence is often treated as a distant echo, referenced indirectly through recovered xenotech, fragmented archaeotechnological artifacts, or interpreted myths passed down across aeons. While direct testimony of their age is absent, the bureaucratic and technological branches of the Imperium have developed tentative impressions, both cautious and analytical, in order to place this ancient civilization within the schema of galactic history. The dating of their rise is set so far back in antiquity that administratum lexicons often place them within the time of myth, acknowledging that while their records cannot measure the exact chronology, the Necrontyr likely thrived tens of millions of years before the rise of the Imperium. For political purposes, administratum categorization often reframes these beings as a cautionary tale, positioning them within archives as exemplars of hubris and downfall. By depicting them as a civilization doomed by their own biology, the administratum underscores one of its ideological pillars: that deviation from the ordained path of humanity leads to ruin. The Adeptus Mechanicus takes a markedly different position. To the priesthood of Mars, the Necrontyr represent not simply a fallen species, but the architects of technology so profound that fragments of their design persist across time. The Mechanicus approaches Necrontyr study with reverence and fear in equal measure. Unlike the Administratum, which regards their story in terms of allegory and caution, the Mechanicus observes their creations as physical truths to be studied, catalogued, and, when possible, replicated. Their records identify the Necrontyr as a civilization that wielded mastery over energy, material sciences, and stellar manipulation at a scale no human society has achieved. Even before their transformation into the Necron state, the Necrontyr had devised weaponry, vehicles and tools that appeared centuries or millennia ahead of Imperial technology in both efficiency and durability. The Mechanicus interprets this as proof that the Necrontyr once stood as the pinnacle of pre-human scientific achievement, rivaled only by the Old Ones. Despite this shared awareness of the Necrontyr, the relationship between the Administratum and the Mechanicus concerning them is marked by tension. The Administratum, tasked with ensuring consistency in the Imperial record, views the Mechanicus' fascination with Necrontyr relics as dangerous. Unrestricted pursuit of alien technologies, especially those rooted in the Necrontyr's history, could destabilize Imperial doctrine. Thus, the Administratum enforces edicts restricting the circulation of archaeological discoveries and suppresses information regarding their more dangerous aspects. In return, the Mechanicus, sworn to their own creed and the authority of the Omnissiah, resists complete subservience to administratum dictates. This ongoing friction has resulted in numerous disputes over artifact custody, with some resolved in carefully worded accords and others buried through quiet erasures of record. One notable cooperation occurred in the management of Necrontyr ruins discovered on the fringes of Imperial exploration zones, where fragments of ancient metallic structures or crystalline weapons were unearthed. The administratum would issue decrees sealing the site, while the Mechanicus would deploy exploratory cohorts to conduct sanctioned excavations. In such agreements, the administratum permitted Mechanicus access on the condition that all findings be filtered back into Imperial archives, though in practice the Mechanicus often withheld or altered details, citing the complexity of techno-arcana incomprehensible to lay scribes. This uneasy cooperation reflects the broader balance of power between the two institutions. The administratum ensures political control of knowledge, while the Mechanicus retains technical dominance over its interpretation. Conflicts also arise when the administratum accuses the Mechanicus of exceeding their mandate. Reports exist of exploratory fleets, dispatched under Mechanicus banners, venturing into restricted void zones believed to house Necrontyr remnants. These expeditions, while never officially acknowledged, sometimes returned with artifacts exhibiting properties not reproducible within the Mechanicus' own forges. The administratum, fearing the political implications of such advancements, classifies them as apocryphal or heretical. Internal disputes sometimes escalate to the level of high councils, where the administratum petitions the High Lords of Terror to curb Mechanicus' overreach. In response, the Mechanicus invokes their autonomy as the keepers of sacred technology, warning that to deny them access to alien knowledge is to risk stagnation. This cycle of accusation and defense has no permanent resolution, but instead creates an ongoing political theatre that ensures neither side gains complete dominance over Necrontyr discourse. Politically, the Necrontyr serve as a kind of contested symbol within Imperial governance. The administratum leverages their story as a parable of inevitable decline, a people undone by mortality, their envy of immortality leading them to destruction. Such narratives reinforce the administratum's emphasis on obedience and submission, positioning the Imperium as a corrective order that resists the same fate. The Mechanicus, by contrast, positions the Necrontyr as evidence of a divine archetype of technology. To them, the machines and tools of the Necrontyr embody the will of the machine god, proving that perfect design transcends biological frailty. This theological interpretation is not universally accepted within the Mechanicus itself, but it remains influential enough to shape their research programs. Political debates within the Mechanicus sometimes reference the Necrontyr as examples of what is possible if humanity dares to pursue the unbounded path of science. These differing impressions also bleed into broader imperial politics. On occasion, High Lords with strong ties to either the administratum or the Mechanicus wield Necrontyr relics or historical accounts as rhetorical tools to strengthen their positions. For example, administratum officials may invoke the Necrontyr as proof of why centralized control of knowledge is necessary, while Mechanicus representatives highlight their discoveries as justification for further autonomy from Terra's oversight. In such exchanges, the Necrontyr become less a historical civilization and more a weapon in the political arsenal of the Imperium. The secrecy surrounding these matters is deliberate. Neither the administratum nor the Mechanicus wishes for the broader populace to become aware of the Necrontyr. To the administratum, public knowledge of such an ancient and advanced race risks undermining the carefully curated myth of humanity's central place in the galaxy. To the Mechanicus, open discourse would invite scrutiny of their excavations, and the possibility of interference from rival factions within the Imperium. Thus, both institutions maintain a silent agreement, however grudging, to obscure the Necrontyr from the wider Imperial citizenry. Only within the most restricted archives, sealed under multiple layers of clearance, are these debates and records preserved. Over time, This shared silence has created a paradoxical cooperation. While the Administratum and Mechanicus disagree fundamentally on the meaning of the Necrontyr, their mutual need for secrecy binds them together. Administratum censors rely on the Mechanicus to translate and interpret technological fragments, while the Mechanicus depends on the Administratum to shield their operations from political and ecclesiastical interference. Neither institution is entirely satisfied with this arrangement, but both understand its necessity. In summation, the Adeptus Administratum views the Necrontyr as an instructive failure, a civilization whose pride and desperation serve as a warning against straying from sanctioned doctrine. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in contrast, regards them as the epitome of technological brilliance, a lost template of knowledge to be revered and studied. Their relationship over this ancient species is defined by both friction and necessity, shaped by politics, secrecy, and the competing imperatives of control and curiosity. Though separated by purpose, the two institutions find themselves entwined in a delicate balance, where the memory of the Necrontyr serves as both battleground and binding thread. The study of Necrontyr wars presents a challenge unparalleled in the annals of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their conflicts occurred so far in the depths of prehistory that even the most sophisticated dating methods struggle to yield precise chronologies. Instead, the Imperium's records rely upon a mixture of fragmentary, archaeological evidence, extrapolated battlefield remains, and comparative mythological analysis. From this fragmented body of material, scholars and tech priests have constructed partial reconstructions of the Necrontyr's martial history, offering insights into their wars, their tactics, and the devastating costs of their campaigns. The earliest recorded pattern of Necrontyr conflict appears internal. Before they ever turn their gaze outward to the stars, the Necrontyr warred among themselves. These wars are believed to have been driven by their harsh environment and the deep divisions within their society. Their homeworld was scarred by radiation storms and short, brutal lifespans. Such conditions fostered a culture in which rival dynasties competed violently for survival. Excavated ruins of early Necrontyr settlements show extensive evidence of fortified structures, defensive barriers, and energy-based weapons that scarred the surrounding stone and sand into glass-like formations. Administratum scholars interpret these findings as proof of a near-constant state of war, where dynastic rulers relied on martial strength to maintain dominance. Quantitative analysis of the ruins indicates that population centres were small and clustered, often wiped out entirely before being resettled. Estimates based on habitation layers suggest cycles of destruction and rebuilding spanning mere centuries. Mechanicus assessments argue that casualty rates in these early dynastic conflicts may have reached as high as 60% of the population in affected regions, with entire bloodlines erased during periods of dynastic collapse. These numbers, while reconstructed rather than directly recorded, are consistent with the scale of devastation evident in their architecture and burial sites. The internal wars escalated further once the Necrontyr mastered interplanetary travel. Dynasties spread beyond their homeworld, carrying their rivalries into new colonies. The resulting conflicts expanded from localized raids into interstellar campaigns. The Mechanicus notes that the propulsion technologies of this period, though primitive compared to later Necron capabilities, nonetheless enabled fleets capable of crossing vast gulfs of space. Battles between dynasties in orbit and across planetary surfaces left behind scars still visible in asteroid belts and barren moons. Statistical models generated from void debris fields suggest engagements that involved hundreds of vessels on each side, with attrition rates of nearly 70% in the most destructive encounters. In some systems, entire planetary colonies appear to have been annihilated through orbital bombardment, leaving behind atmospheres poisoned with exotic isotopes that persist even after millions of years. Administratum scribes classify these wars as the dynastic expansion conflicts. In their interpretation, this period represents the most violent phase of Necrontyr history, marked by an almost pathological compulsion toward internecine struggle. Mechanicus accounts corroborate this view, though they highlight the sophistication of the weapons deployed. Particle beam projectors, resonance disruptors, and focused radiation cannons appear to have been fielded as standard equipment. War machines, preserved in fragmented relics, reveal designs capable of withstanding and delivering destructive energies well beyond contemporary Imperial mainline equivalents. The scale of military deployment in this era suggests that the Necrontyr were able to mobilize entire populations with little distinction between civilian and soldier, a pattern mirrored in the mass graves uncovered in surviving ruins. Beyond their internal strife, the most significant chapter of Necrontyr warfare lies in their confrontation with the Old Ones. This war, known across Imperial lore as one of the defining conflicts of prehistory, marked the Necrontyr's attempt to overturn their own mortality by seizing the knowledge of an elder race. It is believed that the Necrontyr first encountered the Old Ones during their outward expansion, perhaps by following routes of the ancient webway, or by stumbling into regions long cultivated by the Old Ones. The disparity in power was immediate and overwhelming. The Old Ones possessed mastery over the warp and commanded species alliances that dwarfed the Necrontyr fleets. Yet despite this imbalance, the Necrontyr launched war after war against them. Administratum calculations drawn from extrapolated campaign lengths estimate that the Necrontyr's war with the Old Ones may have endured for several million years in cycles of offensive, defeat and retreat. Individual battles are reconstructed through the scars they left upon entire star systems. Planets vitrified from orbit, moons shattered into debris fields, and stellar anomalies traced to weaponized energies all point to the intensity of these confrontations. Mechanicus records estimate that in one campaign alone, believed to have spanned several thousand years, the Necrontyr may have lost up to 90% of their fleet strength, rebuilt only to be lost again in subsequent offensives. The casualty rate among their population is considered incalculable, though given the scale of mobilization, it is assumed to have reached catastrophic levels, potentially erasing entire dynastic lineages from the record. In terms of military statistics, the Old One Wars pushed the Necrontyr into mass militarization. Analysis of archaeological remains suggests that entire planetary populations were conscripted. Fortification complexes were expanded on a global scale, some stretching across continents, designed to withstand warp-based assaults that the Old Ones unleashed. Mechanicus models suggest that the energy demands of these defensive systems rivaled that of entire stars, leading the Necrontyr to develop energy siphoning and stellar harnessing technologies. These innovations, while remarkable, came at extraordinary cost. Evidence indicates the collapse of planetary biospheres sacrificed to fuel their war machines, creating wastelands where once habitable worlds had existed. The war with the Old Ones also revealed the Necrontyr's profound strategic disadvantages. Lacking warp navigation, they were bound by the limits of material space. Their fleets, though powerful, moved slowly compared to the warp-capable forces of their enemies. Administratum analysts highlight this as the single greatest strategic failing of the Necrontyr military, forcing them into defensive postures and reactive campaigns. Entire systems could be bypassed or surrounded by Old One forces, leaving Necrontyr defenses isolated and eventually overwhelmed. Statistical projections suggest that for every Necrontyr victory, perhaps 5 or more defeats followed, a ratio that would have bled any lesser civilization into extinction. That the Necrontyr endured at all testifies to their sheer numbers and the relentless cycle of militarization that consumed their society. Another layer of notable battles lies in their later campaigns alongside and eventually under the C'tan. While this transition marks the beginning of their transformation into the Necrons, the wars waged during this phase still reflect the martial nature of the Necrontyr in their pre-biotransference state. With the C'tan's arrival, statistical reports shift dramatically. Mechanicus extrapolations suggest casualty rates among the Necrontyr forces dropped significantly, as their new starborn allies provided them with near-invincible weaponry. Old One forces, once overwhelmingly superior, began to suffer losses at unprecedented rates. Planetary biospheres were destroyed systematically through the C'tan's energies, leaving administratum historians to calculate that entire sectors were sterilized. Estimates suggest that during the height of these wars, star systems were destroyed at a frequency of 1 per millennium. though this remains speculative due to the lack of physical evidence preserved across such time spans. The Administratum records these wars with caution, emphasizing the moral lesson of hubris and the catastrophic cost of seeking power through alien alliances. Their statistical reconstructions, while heavily redacted for wider imperial consumption, nonetheless reveal a grim tally. Entire civilizations allied with the Old Ones appear to have been annihilated, while the Necrontyr themselves were hollowed out by their reliance on the C'tan. Mechanicus sources are more explicit, detailing the massive reconfiguration of Necrontyr military forces. Fleet sizes are estimated to have reached into the millions of vessels, planetary armies numbering in the trillions, and resource consumption that eclipsed anything seen in human history. The Mechanicus regards this as a turning point in galactic war, where the scale of conflict achieved by the Necrontyr and the C'tan together exceeded any recorded campaign until the modern age of the Imperium. In reviewing these wars, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus focus on different statistical emphases. The Administratum is preoccupied with human comprehension of loss and the political consequences of endless war. Their records stress the unsustainability of Necrontyr militarization, suggesting that their society was effectively devoured by its own armies. The Mechanicus, by contrast, is fascinated by the logistical achievements underlying such wars. For them, the ability to field fleets numbering in the millions and sustain wars across millions of years is a marvel of efficiency, even if achieved at the expense of the species itself. Thus, the wars of the Necrontyr are remembered less as individual campaigns and more as patterns of destruction and survival. Each dynastic conflict, each interstellar campaign, and each war against the Old Ones reinforce the same truths: extraordinary technological brilliance, profound strategic weaknesses, and catastrophic loss of life. The statistics reconstructed by Imperial scholars cannot claim absolute accuracy, yet they convey the scale with sufficient clarity to leave no doubt. The Necrontyr waged wars of such immensity that they reshaped entire regions of the galaxy, leaving scars visible even after tens of millions of years. The political dimensions of Necrontyr history occupy a unique place within the archives of both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where the wars of the Necrontyr can be reconstructed through the scars of battle and the ruins of their fortifications, their politics must be inferred from patterns, dynastic structures, and the echoes of decisions that determined their fate. The Administratum treats these political legacies as instructive allegories of hubris and collapse, while the Mechanicus interprets them as evidence of the stresses placed upon a society pursuing technological advancement without balance. Both institutions, while divergent in tone, arrive at a similar conclusion. The Necrontyr were undone as much by their internal politics as by their external wars. Administratum scribes identify the dynastic structure of Necrontyr society as both its strength and its fatal flaw. Each dynasty functioned as a sovereign polity, ruled by a line of kings or lords who derived legitimacy from hereditary succession, reinforced through military dominance. These dynasties engaged in near-constant rivalry, expending vast resources on internal competition rather than external unity. In the eyes of the Administratum, this mirrored the dangers of unchecked feudalism within human polities. By comparing the Necrontyr dynasties to human noble houses that fractured empires during the Age of Strife, Administratum historians underline the dangers of decentralized authority. Their gain-loss assessments emphasize that even at their peak, the Necrontyr wasted enormous military and economic potential in wars of succession, eroding the cohesion necessary to endure external threats such as the Old Ones. The Mechanicus, while acknowledging the destructiveness of dynastic politics, interprets these divisions less as moral failings and more as systemic inefficiencies. For them, the dynastic structure limited the scale of technological collaboration, preventing the Necrontyr from achieving full standardization of their innovations. Analysis of recovered artifacts reveals notable variations between dynastic arsenals, with different clans deploying distinct models of particle weaponry, shielding systems, or war engines. Mechanicus logicians argue that such fragmentation reflected not a lack of ingenuity, but a failure to unify resource allocation. Where one dynasty might pour vast resources into stellar energy siphoning, another might prioritize void ship propulsion, and a third the refinement of atmospheric containment domes. The result in their analysis was a patchwork of brilliance undermined by redundancy and incompatibility. From a political standpoint, both the Administratum and Mechanicus recognized the unifying effect of the War in Heaven, the great conflict against the Old Ones. It was during this crisis that dynastic rivalries gave way, however briefly, to collective survival. For the Administratum, this reflects a familiar historical pattern. Existential threats compel unity where diplomacy fails. They note that the Necrontyr's ability to mobilize on such a scale demonstrates that unity was possible, but only under duress. Mechanicus sources record this period as one of accelerated technological advancement, with dynasties pooling their discoveries under central command structures in ways previously unseen. Yet this unity proved temporary, fraying once the immediate pressures shifted and eventually replaced by dependence on the C'tan. The Administratum interprets this as proof that unity imposed from necessity rather than ideology cannot last, while the Mechanicus sees it as evidence of the limits of social engineering without a stable political framework. Gain and loss assessments are at the core of Administratum political analysis. Their records emphasize the Necrontyr's catastrophic population losses, resource depletion, and cultural erosion. In their calculations, the species squandered entire worlds not only in wars of conquest but in the energy expenditures required to power their weapons. Administratum scribes record these expenditures as net losses, arguing that no amount of technological achievement could compensate for the destruction of their demographic base. Where the Mechanicus might see a triumph of engineering in a planetary shield capable of channeling stellar radiation, the Administratum views only the empty husk of a planet stripped of life in the process. The tally, in their assessment, is one of negative return. Resources and populations consumed in service of wars that yielded no lasting stability. The Mechanicus calculates gains differently. Their focus lies in the efficiency and innovation achieved under duress. To them, the Necrontyr demonstrated the ability to extract energy at scales that modern Imperial forges cannot replicate, to construct voidcraft that endured millions of years without complete degradation, and to field armies with logistical systems capable of sustaining conflicts across stellar distances. Even in their losses, the Mechanicus identifies gains of knowledge, considering their ruins as silent textbooks for the initiated. In this perspective, the Necrontyr did not fail technologically, but politically. Their brilliance was real, their science effective, but their political framework insufficient to preserve the continuity necessary to harness these gains indefinitely. These divergent analyses also feed into bureaucratic debates within the Imperium. Administratum scribes use the Necrontyr as a case study to justify centralized control of knowledge and governance. In their rhetorical framework, the dynastic fracturing of the Necrontyr mirrors the danger of allowing too much autonomy to sub-factions within the Imperium. To prevent humanity from repeating their fate, they argue for the concentration of authority and terror, and for the suppression of knowledge that might embolden separatist or heretical movements. The Mechanicus resist this narrative, pointing out that Necrontyr brilliance stemmed precisely from their refusal to submit to central dogma. For them, the lesson is not obedience, but collaboration tempered with autonomy. Innovation flourishes where multiple approaches are tested, even if they generate political rivalry. Political issues also extend into questions of morality and ethics. The Administratum frames the Necrontyr's eventual pact with the C'tan as the inevitable endpoint of political desperation. By sacrificing their autonomy to alien star gods, they surrendered not only their physical bodies but also their political sovereignty. Administratum analysis portrays this as the ultimate proof of their unfitness for survival. No civilization, in their assessment, can endure once it cedes political agency to external powers. The Mechanicus counters with a more technical framing, suggesting that the pact represented not political collapse, but a form of radical adaptation. In their interpretation, the Necrontyr faced extinction through biology and external war. Their decision to embrace the Catan was a calculated strategy to preserve continuity, albeit at terrible cost. While they acknowledge the horror of biotransference, they argue that it reflects a rational, if desperate, political choice within the parameters of survival. Internal bureaucratic discussions between the Administratum and the Mechanicus frequently revisit these divergent interpretations. Reports circulated at the highest levels record tense exchanges over how to classify Necrontyr history in official archives. Administratum officials insist upon a moralized narrative of decline, fearing that to emphasize their brilliance risks inspiring dangerous curiosity among imperial citizens. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, lobbies to preserve and expand their access to Necrontyr relics, arguing that the Imperium's survival depends upon recovering even fragments of their efficiency. The resulting compromises take the form of redacted archives, sealed excavation reports, and restricted access vaults, where only those of the highest rank may view the unfiltered data. The final analysis, as compiled jointly though reluctantly by both institutions, presents the Necrontyr as a species defined by contradiction. They were technologically brilliant yet politically fractured, militarily formidable yet strategically disadvantaged, united under threat yet fatally divided by dynastic rivalries. For the Administratum, the lesson is that political cohesion and obedience must always supersede technological or military power, lest brilliance collapse into ruin. For the Mechanicus, the lesson is that technology without political stability is squandered, and that even brilliance cannot outlast disunity. The political issues surrounding the Necrontyr continue to resonate within imperial governance. To the Administratum, they justify the suppression of unsanctioned inquiry. To the Mechanicus, they fuel the ongoing quest to recover lost archaeotech. Between them lies a fragile balance, the need to preserve the Imperium's ideological unity, while quietly pursuing the fragments of knowledge that might strengthen its hand. In this balance, the Necrontyr remain a cautionary symbol and a tantalizing promise, a reminder that even in collapse, their politics and their choices shape the course of galactic history. The scattered records of the Necrontyr, compiled and recompiled across countless inquisitorial vaults, are approached with more caution than almost any other extinct species. To the agents of the Ordo Xenos, the Necrontyr are not simply a dead civilization. They are viewed as the shadow of a far more enduring and insidious presence, the Necrons themselves. As such, impressions of the Necrontyr are not drawn from neutral archaeological curiosity, but from the perspective of threat analysis, suspicion, and a desire to establish continuity between the ancient, frail empire and the modern, undying legions of living metal. The Inquisition records describe the Necrontyr as a culture poisoned from within by desperation and mortality. To their scholars, this mortality fixation is seen as both their greatest weakness and the catalyst of their transformation. Inquisitors frequently remark that a race whose entire ethos revolved around the inevitability of death would inevitably pursue measures of survival that would unsettle the galaxy. Their reliance on arcane science, their reckless deployment of stellar weapons, and their obsessive drive for continuity are interpreted as early warning signs of what would later manifest in the soulless persistence of the Necron dynasties. From the perspective of the Ordo Xenos, the Necrontyr's political structure is studied less as a sovereign civilization and more as a blueprint for how their modern descendants operate. The Inquisition often frames the Necrontyr's dynastic houses and rigid hierarchy as the primordial scaffolding of the Necron command system. Records suggest that even in their mortal state, the Necrontyr displayed authoritarian impulses, a dynastic rigidity, and an obsession with ritualized succession. To inquisitorial analysis, this continuity reinforces the belief that the Necrontyr never truly died, but simply shed one form for another. Impressions of their technology are deeply cautious. Many inquisitorial reports suggest that even in their pre-biotransference state, the Necrontyr possessed weapons of staggering consequence, stellar engines, solar-draining constructs, and war machines capable of reducing worlds to husks. Cross-referencing these descriptions with known Necron weaponry, the Inquisition concludes that the Necrontyr were not merely advanced, but catastrophically reckless, willing to deploy weapons that would scar entire systems without hesitation. It is this recklessness, more than their later transformation, that is often cited as the reason the Necrontyr are studied as a potential model for other civilizations that might one day gamble with forbidden technologies. The Inquisition also considers their temperament. Surviving fragments of Xenos records suggest that the Necrontyr lived in perpetual conflict, feuding with each other as much as with external threats. The Ordo Xenos interprets this as both a survival adaptation and a sign of instability. To many Inquisitors, the Necrontyr were a people incapable of peace, consumed by bitterness at their own brief lives, turning their fury against the stars themselves. These impressions form part of the Inquisition's larger thesis, that the Necrontyr were destined to collapse without intervention, and that their pact with the C'tan was not simply opportunistic, but the natural culmination of a culture defined by despair. Among the Inquisition's records, it is common to find warnings against dismissing the Necrontyr as extinct. The rhetoric is consistent. The Necrontyr were not a people that died, but a people that transformed, and their legacy is not fossilized ruins, but the mechanical persistence of the Necron dynasties. In this sense, the Inquisition does not treat their history as closed, but as a living precedent. Every study of Necrontyr artifacts, every excavation of their ruins, is approached with the assumption that it connects directly to the active threat of Necron dominion. Thus, the impressions recorded by the Inquisition are not those of impartial scholars, but of guardians on perpetual alert. To them, the Necrontyr embody the archetype of a civilization that surrendered its morality, stability and future for survival at any cost. Their story is wielded as a cautionary example within inquisitorial academies, illustrating the fate of any species that seeks to overcome its natural limits by making bargains with powers beyond comprehension. For the Inquisition, the Necrontyr are not remembered as a dead people, but as a warning made flesh, their shadow still moving in the endless march of the Necron legions. Within the Inquisition's most restricted archives, locked behind sigil-sealed data crypts, are the materials that speak of the Necrontyr in tones not meant for wider dissemination. These documents are not accessible even to most within the Ordo Xenos, for they contain fragments deemed too disruptive, too suggestive, or too easily misinterpreted by those lacking the discipline of absolute secrecy. It is in these records that the Necrontyr are presented not merely as a civilization of the past, but as a species whose shadow may yet stretch across the present. The classified reports make repeated reference to artifacts unearthed across Imperial space, ruins not of Necron construction, but unmistakably predating them. Certain inscriptions and structural features suggest biological habitation, unlike the sterile mechanical tombs of the Necron dynasties. In some chambers, wall markings depict figures frail and elongated, often clutching rods of power or depicted in acts of submission before greater starborn entities. The iconography is considered too dangerous to circulate widely, for it strengthens the hypothesis that the C'tan were worshipped not only as benefactors, but as deities long before the biotransference occurred. The implication that the Necrontyr engaged in what might be termed a covenant rather than enslavement is considered politically destabilizing, for it suggests complicity rather than victimhood. Another set of sealed files references reports of living Necrontyr remnants. Though these claims are unsubstantiated and heavily redacted, certain Ordo agents insist that small populations of biologically intact Necrontyr may have survived the war in heaven, hidden in isolated stellar pockets or temporal anomalies. No physical evidence has been brought forth to confirm such assertions, yet the possibility that fragile, decaying Necrontyr may still exist is treated as an existential risk. If true, such survivors would represent a biological key to understanding the transformation into Necron form, knowledge the Adeptus Mechanicus has petitioned to acquire, but which the Inquisition has suppressed without hesitation. The most heavily sealed reports describe cross-references between the Necrontyr and other Xenos mythologies. Certain Ordo scholars note troubling similarities between Necrontyr star hymns, preserved in fragmentary form, and legends carried among human pre-imperial cultures, particularly those dealing with dying gods, bargain-seeking mortals, and the theft of the sun's fire. The implication that the Necrontyr may have influenced, directly or indirectly, the myths of mankind prior to the rise of the Imperium is considered heretical in the extreme. Such records are stamped for obliteration, yet fragments persist in hidden codices and suppressed Skolem archives. Even more alarming are the files documenting anomalous psychic impressions tied to Necrontyr ruins. Several sanctioned psychers deployed in excavations have perished after exposure to artifacts that should hold no warp resonance. Reports describe sensations of suffocation, visions of collapsing suns, and voices urging the embrace of eternity at any cost. These events are disturbing precisely because the Necrontyr were not warp-sensitive. The prevailing interpretation within the sealed files is that the psychic echoes do not originate from the Necrontyr themselves, but from their pact with the Catan, whose essence may have imprinted upon their civilization in ways that still echo through matter and time. Finally, among the most suppressed records is an assessment drafted by an anonymous inquisitor, its authorship deliberately erased. It suggests that the Necrontyr did not simply seek escape from mortality, but sought to spread their condition to others. Certain stellar-scale constructs recovered in ruins across dead systems are interpreted not as defensive measures, but as experiments in radiating their life-shortening affliction outward. If this thesis is correct, then the Necrontyr were not merely a dying race, but an actively hostile one, determined to drag others into their suffering. The possibility that such mechanisms could still exist, dormant in the galaxy, is recorded with utmost secrecy, lest it provoke mass panic or tempt forbidden investigation. In these highly classified records, the Necrontyr are not remembered as victims of circumstance, nor as tragic figures of desperation. They are cast as participants in their own downfall, complicit in bargains with cosmic predators, and perhaps intent on sharing their curse with the galaxy. For this reason, the Inquisition safeguards such knowledge not only to protect humanity from external threat, but to protect it from dangerous understanding. The Necrontyr's history, in its most secret form, is treated as a mirror to humanity's own vulnerabilities, a record of what happens when mortality becomes obsession and when survival eclipses all other values. The final analysis of the Necrontyr, preserved only in the most restricted strata of the Inquisition's data vaults, is presented not as history, but as a warning. Unlike other Xenos civilizations whose chronicles may be dissected for strategic or cultural insight, the Necrontyr represent a lesson so severe that the knowledge itself is considered corrosive. What follows has been flagged repeatedly as a suppressed doctrinal entry, forbidden from circulation beyond the Ordo's highest conclaves. The Necrontyr are assessed not merely as a fallen species, but as an eternal caution against unchecked desperation. In the view of the Inquisition, theirs was not the tragedy of extinction, but the crime of surrender. Faced with mortality, they did not resist with fortitude or faith. They chose instead to barter their essence, binding themselves to entities whose appetites eclipsed even the ruin of suns. This willingness to compromise identity for survival, to trade all values for a reprieve from death, is recorded as their defining sin. It is judged not as weakness alone, but as a contagion, an example that, if emulated, could imperil humanity's own course. The doctrinal warning emphasizes that the Necrontyr's downfall was not instantaneous but gradual, hidden beneath rationalizations and promises of deliverance. Their society, once structured around unity against a common affliction, fractured under the weight of opportunity presented by the Catan. Leaders justified capitulation as salvation, warriors accepted the promise of invincibility, and civilians submitted in the hope that tomorrow would bring relief. Each step was incremental, each decision couched in necessity, until the sum of their choices delivered them to enslavement. The lesson drawn is that corruption does not descend all at once, but through many small concessions masked as pragmatic choices. The analysis further observes that the Necrontyr sought to universalize their condition. Some evidence, drawn from sealed Mechanicus excavation reports, indicates that stellar constructs may have been designed to transmit their life-shortening affliction across the void. Whether these devices were weapons, experiments, or instruments of despair remains unknown. Yet their existence reveals an impulse not merely to endure their suffering, but to spread it, to impose it upon others as if to validate their own damnation. In the eyes of the Inquisition, this act strips the Necrontyr of any claim to victimhood. They are defined instead as aggressors, predators driven not by hunger, but by the compulsion to ensure that no other species would escape the shadow of their fate. The doctrinal judgment closes with explicit application to humanity. It states, in language more severe than most Ordo decrees, that the Imperium must never allow its desperation to drive it towards similar bargains. The dangers of alien technology, the allure of forbidden knowledge, and the temptation of promises offered by powers beyond comprehension are declared to be the very paths by which mankind might repeat the Necrontyr's descent. To embrace survival at any cost is to embrace extinction in all but name. The final passage is concise and absolute, written as if to engrave itself upon the conscience of every Inquisitor who encounters it. It states that the Necrontyr's legacy is not their empire, their science, nor even their transformation into the undying forms of the Necrons. Their true legacy is the proof that a civilization can willingly erase itself in the pursuit of eternity. The warning concludes that this knowledge must remain buried, not to shield humanity from alien truth, but to shield it from the temptation to follow the same path. Thus ends the Inquisition's suppressed doctrinal analysis of the Necrontyr. It is not a record meant to enlighten, nor a history meant to instruct. It is a sealed caution, a judgment written in secrecy, a reminder that the gravest threat to mankind is not always the Xenos without, but the weakness within.